Greetings, Hunter History 151ers. This is your professor, great facilitator, whatever you want to call me, Dr. Dylan Carroll. And this is your makeup lecture scheduled for March 26th, but because of the snow day, we had to take the midterm. So, we're going to be looking at the era of good feelings, so-called, today. And just to pull back before we get going and recount, refresh what was happening before, Jefferson is president in the early 1800s. And because of events in Europe, he gets pulled into an international event. And to avoid war, Jefferson persuades Congress in December of 1807 to pass the Embargo Act, a ban on American vessels sailing for foreign ports. This is a very grainy map of the votes for and against the Embargo Act. The areas in green were yeas in favor of the Embargo Act. The areas in yellow were nays in opposition to the Embargo Act. The areas in that purplish gray area didn't vote or abstained or didn't have representation yet. And as you can see, opposition to the Embargo Act is centered in the New England states, which makes sense because shipping there was going to be greatly affected, and indeed it was. But we can also see that there's opposition to the Embargo Act in the Chesapeake and also in the South. So it's a very controversial measure. And indeed, the Embargo Act is an absolute disaster for the Jefferson administration. It fails to achieve its diplomatic goals, as the United Kingdom continued to impress U.S. sailors to kidnap U.S. sailors and make them serve on British vessels. More citizens violated the order to continue trading with Europe and beyond. And farmers, who are Jefferson's base, suffered from lack of trade and lack of access to markets. So the whole country suffers from the Embargo Act. In 1808, Jefferson left after 2 terms at the lowest point ever in his professional career. And he was succeeded by his hand-picked successor, James Madison. This is not James Madison, of course. This is his wife, Dolly Madison. And I put Dolly Madison up here because Dolly campaigned furiously for her husband. She spent the year writing constant letters and hosting constant parties to help her husband, James Madison, defeat his Federalist rival, Charles Pinckney, in the 1808 election. Dolly's influence was so strong that indeed Charles Pinckney, after he lost the election, noted, quote, "I might have had a better chance had I faced Mr. Madison alone, but I was beaten by Mr. and Mrs. Madison." She's quite an incredible historical figure. James Madison inherited Jefferson's diplomatic troubles. But in addition to the diplomatic troubles he inherits from Jefferson, he also has to contend with a new generation of politicians. These were young, brash, nationalist politicians known collectively as the Warhawks. They included representatives such as Henry Clay from Tennessee and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. These men argued that the U.S. had to defend its honor against violations from the United Kingdom and against violations from Native Americans. And they had to defend their honor violently if necessary. In 1811, Felix Grundy, who was a representative in the House from Tennessee, gave a speech which gives us a sense of the nature of these new generation of politicians, the Warhawks. What, Mr. Speaker, are we now called on to decide? Grundy exclaimed from the floor of the House. It is whether we will resist by force the attempt made by the British government to subject our maritime rights to the arbitrary and capricious rule of her will. For my part, I am not prepared to say that this country shall submit to her commerce interdicted or regulated by any foreign nation. Sir, I prefer war to submission. This war, if carried on successfully, Grundy argued, will have its advantages. We shall drive the British from our continent. They will no longer have an opportunity of intriguing with our Indian neighbors and setting on the ruthless savage to tomahawk our women and children. That nation will lose her Canadian trade, and, by having no resting place in this country, her means of annoying us will be diminished. I am willing to receive the Canadians as adopted brethren. It will have beneficial political effects. It will preserve the equilibrium of the government. End quote. So what we see in Grundy's document here is a willingness to go to war. As Grundy says, he prefers, quote, war to submission. Madison doesn't want to go to war. This is not something he wants to do, but he's pushed by these warhawk politicians to resist the further impressments and the reports of the British encouraging Native American rebellions. And because they make a call to honor, because it's about defending the honor of the United States, Madison shortly has little option. And in June of 1812, Madison asks Congress for a declaration of war against the United Kingdom. This begins the War of 1812. And part of what the Warhawks were crying about and what Americans felt was captured in this cartoon. The belief that the British were encouraging Native American attacks on American colonists on the frontier. This is a cartoon of Native Americans scalping American soldiers and presenting those scalps to British officers. To my knowledge, we don't have any evidence of this actually happening, but Americans really believed that this was the case. And so, sometimes perceptions are reality. The War of 1812 should be conceived of as a two-front war. A war on the Eastern Front, mostly centering in Maryland and Virginia, and that was a war against the British mainly, and a war on the Western Front, which was a war that had battles in Canada and Vermont and Ohio and the Mississippi Territory and Louisiana. And that was mostly Americans versus the Native Americans and also the Canadians. On the Western Front, the U.S. scores some early wins. They defeat the British Navy on Lake Erie. They repulse a British assault on Fort McHenry at Baltimore, where Francis Scott Key composed the famous Star-Spangled Banner. And in the Western Theater, American generals score huge defeats against Native American armies. Andrew Jackson defeats a Creek army at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, and then slaughters most of the inhabitants in a genocidal coda to the battle. William Henry Harrison defeats indigenous forces at the Battle of the Thames. But on the Eastern Front, the war is a disaster. The U.S. launches 2 invasions of Canada. The British defeat both. The United Kingdom blockades the U.S. destroying and hurting much of America's commerce. And then in 1814, the British launch a spectacular invasion of the U.S., and they march all the way, almost unopposed, to Washington, D.C., where they seize most of the Capitol and burn down the White House. The Madisons stayed in the White House as long as they could, coordinating at first the resistance and then the retreat. Dolly Madison stayed as long as she could, and the last thing she took was the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington off of the wall and preserved it before the White House was burned down. This became an iconic moment in history and really preserved Dolly Madison's fame for saving the portrait of George Washington. And indeed, that's what most Americans knew her for, although I think that she should be known for much more. The war ended in 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent. And essentially, the treaty restores the previous status quo, which was about as good as the United States could expect. This is considered by many historians the Second War of Independence. It's the last time, finally, that the U.S. is going to invade Canada. The U.S. invaded Canada during the Revolution as well and launched a second invasion in the War of 1812. Both were unsuccessful. And it's the Canadian invasion in the War of 1812 that really launched his Canadian identity. And it proved the U.S. could conduct a war without destroying itself, that a new republic could conduct a war without collapsing. William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson were the immediate stars from the war. Their status was immeasurably increased by the war and their victories. Both would become future presidents. Andrew Jackson in 1828 and William Henry Harrison in 1840. But perhaps most significantly, the Federalist Party was destroyed by the War of 1812. In December of 1814, a group of Federalists gathered in Hartford, Connecticut, and they called for amending the Constitution to prohibit a trade embargo, to call for a 2/3 majority for a vote for war, and they also called for amending the Constitution to get rid of the 3/5 clause and affirming the right of states to interpose its authority if the federal government violated the Constitution. And so essentially, the Hartford Convention meets to try and break the Jeffersonian Republicans' hold on government. They wanted to remove the 3/5 clause, which counted black slaves as 3/5 of a vote because it gave Southerners so much of an advantage. They wanted to break that. They also called for the President of the United States. Each president had to come from a different state. And that was to try and break the hold of Virginia on the White House. Remember, we're on our fourth president by the War of 1812. 3 of them were from Virginia. Only John Adams was from Massachusetts. And following the end of the war, once the war is, partially successful, it's not a complete defeat, but it's certainly not successful. But following the war, Federalists who met at Hartford looked disloyal and treasonous, and their party was destroyed. And it sent a message, really, throughout American political history, that opposition to a war is very dangerous. And indeed, we don't see that sort of mass party opposition to a war almost really ever again. The Whigs are going to have some opposition to the Mexican-American War, but there was no major opposition to any war really ever since the Hartford Convention, because the message was so clear. This is a cartoon about the Hartford Convention, showing representatives from the New England states on the edge of a cliff about to jump off, and they're all urging each other to jump off. And waiting for them is the King of England, who says, "Oh, 'tis my Yankee boys. Jump in, my fine fellows. Molasses and codfish, plenty of goods to smuggle, honors, titles, and nobility into the bargain." And the message was that the Federalists were treasonous, that they were jumping into the arms of the British, opposed to the War of 1812 in a treasonous manner. That was not exactly the case, but again, appearances sometimes are more powerful than reality. So, this begins the era of good feelings. And the era of good feelings is a new sort of brief period that moved away from the era of passions. Political passions subsided after the War of 1812, and that was mostly due because the Federalist Party was destroyed. That from essentially 1815 to 1824, the U.S. was under one-party rule. The Jeffersonian Republican Party was really the only party running the show for a decade. This decade known as the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings sees the Jeffersonian Republican Party take a massive political shift. Madison moves away from Jefferson's vision of what the country should look like. He does this with what becomes known as his American system. It was a multi-platform vision for the future of the country, including a new national bank. Remember, Jefferson had hated national banks, thought banks were the enemy. A new tariff on imported manufactured goods, trying to set up a tax on imported goods to artificially protect domestic manufactured goods, and federal financing to improve infrastructure, to improve roads and canals and national infrastructure. This is a tremendous break from Jefferson, who hated all of these things, who did not think that this was the way forward. Madison makes a massive shift from Jefferson's policies. The tariff was a 20 to 25% tax on imported manufactured goods, mostly designed to protect the fledgling cotton mills in New England that sprouted up in the wake of the War of 1812 and the collapse of the shipping and trade industry. The National Bank was created to issue paper money, collect taxes, but also ensure that paper money issued by other banks had actual value. Local banks had risen to 200 by the 18 teens and 1820s. And the National Bank was charged with making sure that credit was not too widespread, that there was some value behind this currency popping up in these banks. Because remember, there isn't any sort of dollar, there isn't a national currency yet. So banks are basically creating their own currency, their own notes. And they could be of various kinds of values. So the National Bank is designed to make sure that there's some actual value backing up these notes. This was the early national bank, the first one that was created. However, the era of good feelings quickly comes to an end. Historians officially say the era of good feelings ends with the election of 1824. But I would argue the era of good feelings comes to a quicker end than that. It starts with the 1816 Salary Act. In 1816, members of Congress passed the Salary Act, which gave themselves a raise for the first time in American political history. Voters were furious that congressmen had given themselves a raise. It seemed corrupt. It seemed self-serving. And so in the midterm elections, 70% of incumbents were voted out because of the 1816 Salary Act. Voters don't like corruption. They don't like their representatives going to office to make money and who seem seemingly corrupt. Just look at Scott Pruitt right now, the EPA administrator. He's having a hell of a time fighting rumors, perceived and real, of his corruption. But the era of good feelings also collapsed over the controversies of the 18 teens and 1820s, including the first peacetime recession, the Panic of 1819, and the Missouri controversy, the controversy over admitting Missouri to the Union, a slave state. Okay. James Monroe, another Virginian, succeeds James Madison as president. And Monroe's tenure in the White House is really a disaster, bookended by multiple emergencies, none really of his making. It's not really his fault. He's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The first was the Panic of 1819, the first peacetime recession in American history. And part of what added to the Panic of 1819 was the National Bank, ironically. The National Bank was created to regulate the credit market in the United States. But instead of regulating credit, the National Bank contributed to the speculative fever of the 19 teens. It contributed to all the land and crop speculation, creating a bubble in land and cotton in the 18 teens, and that bubble eventually burst in 1819. First, the War of 1812 had created huge land opportunities, as Native Americans were the big losers of the War of 1812, and they were forced to cede huge land cessions after the war. The area on this map in yellow was land that was ceded by Native Americans to the United States between 1811 and 1830, much of it ceded after the War of 1812. The Creeks, for instance, lost 23 million acres in the peace treaties after the War of 1812. Much of modern-day Illinois was ceded after the War of 1812. This created huge land speculation from 1815 to 1819, as suddenly huge tracts of land are open to American migration and American farmers after the War of 1812. Farmers move particularly to the modern-day Southeast, where they begin to produce cotton. Cotton was hugely in demand, and this raises prices by 30 cents per pound. Remember, cotton had previously been not very popular because it's really labor intensive. In order to make serviceable cotton, you have to separate the seeds from the fibers, and it's a very labor intensive process. But in the 1790s, Eli Whitney, a Connecticut Yankee, creates the cotton gin. He doesn't actually create it, he modifies an existing cotton gin. And what the cotton gin did was essentially easily and quickly separate the seeds from the fibers. You would put raw cotton into this engine, gin was short for engine, where you would hand crank the raw cotton through a series of essentially metal teeth that would then separate the seeds from the fiber, and you would get seedless cotton out of this engine, out of this gin. This creates a huge boom in cotton because suddenly it's easy to mass produce cotton and it becomes incredibly valuable. And everywhere farmers and planters go in the South, in the modern day Southeast, what was then called the Southwest, they produce cotton. This is a map of crops in the American South, and as you can see, cotton in this sort of fuchsia pink dominates much of the American modern-day Southeast. By 1819, however, land speculation slowed down, as did the demand for cotton and grain. And in 1819, a decline in prices led to a financial panic. A bumper crop in cotton that year in 1819 led to a decline in prices, and investors began to panic. Because of the decline in prices, banks worried and investors worried about recouping their loans, about recouping their investments in land and cotton. And so panicky banks began to call in their loans. They began to say, look, we need our money back. You need to start making payments on your loan. Debtors, particularly debtor farmers in the South and the West, they are deep in debt and they can't pay. And many of these debts go unfulfilled, and the banks, who are way overinvested in land and cotton during this period, began one by one to collapse. Remember, there is no FDIC. There is no Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation that protects banks and investments. And so if a bank goes under, that's it. It's done. And if you had any sort of investment or money in that bank, it was gone. It vanished overnight. The credit market contracts. And the National Bank makes things worse by calling in their loans as well and not allowing flexibility. In hindsight, the National Bank, as they do in later recessions and panics, they should have put out more money and allowed for flexibility to try and calm investors and keep the market calm. But they're new at this. The National Bank's brand new, and the people running the bank don't really know what they're doing. And so they help contribute to a contraction of the market by calling in their loans as well. All of this creates the first major economic recession in peacetime in American history, known as the Panic of 1819. It only lasts about a year. So measured with other panics, such as the Panic of 1837, which lasts almost a decade, it's not very severe, but it has severe consequences. Americans in the West, farmers in the West, were hit hardest. They suffered large foreclosures and high unemployment. And Western states began to experiment with debt relief. Many suspended debt collection. But after the Panic of 1819, many farmers began to distrust banks, especially the National Bank. And the National Bank becomes a straw man, a boogeyman for many Americans, and it's going to have huge lasting consequences for future American elections. One of Monroe's lasting contributions took his name and became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Between 1810 and 1820, the Empire of Spain's Latin American colonies rose up in a series of rebellions. Most of these rebellions were successful, and independent nations broke away from the Spanish Empire and claimed independence. They included independent nations such as Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. By 1825, Spain only controlled Cuba and Puerto Rico, their once vast colonial empire of the Western Hemisphere, destroyed. James Monroe extended recognition of these new nations as independent nations in the Western Hemisphere, including Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, etc. John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State, drafted what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was this. It held that the U.S. would oppose future European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. which essentially meant that the U.S. was declaring the Western Hemisphere as off limits for European colonization. In return, the U.S. promised that they would stay out of European affairs as well. This was a warning to Europeans and European nations to leave the Americas alone, that this was an American sphere of influence. The Western Hemisphere was an American sphere of influence. James Monroe claimed in his speech of the Monroe Doctrine, quote, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of North or South America without endangering our peace and happiness, nor can anyone believe that our Southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord." So again, essentially, the Monroe Doctrine declares the Western Hemisphere off limits for European colonization and promises the U.S. will stay out of European affairs. This seems, initially sort of high and mighty that the U.S. is declaring South America independent from Europe, and they will sort of protect and recognize their independence. And perhaps indeed initially it was. But later in the 20th century, the Monroe Doctrine becomes justification for the U.S., for the United States, to interfere with South American politics and independence. And indeed, President Theodore Roosevelt and his successors would repeatedly invade South American countries to protect American economic interests. The U.S. invaded Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. There was more than 20 invasions of South American countries between 1904 and 1920. So while the Monroe Doctrine may have initially had some more lofty inspirations, by the 20th century it becomes a darker justification of American intervention throughout the Western Hemisphere. A note about this old geezer, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had seen his reputation enormously improved by the War of 1812. And after the war, Jackson prospered. He acquired a plantation in Tennessee that he called the Hermitage. And Jackson was, like many current or many former American presidents, a slave owner. He enslaved more than 200 African Americans on the Hermitage to plant and harvest cotton on his plantation. In 1822, his political career began. He became a senator from the state of Tennessee. He advocated removing Native Americans from the West, a position he would continue to hold throughout his political life. He raged against banks after the Panic of 1819, and banks become the boogeyman for Jackson, a straw man he breaks down more than once. And he advocated more democracy for working-class white Americans, and only for working-class white Americans. Jefferson, who served in the Senate with Jackson at the time, or who saw Jackson in the Senate, he didn't serve, he was retired, remembered Jackson as a politician who, quote, literally choked with rage. Jackson was a violent man living in a violent time. Before he was president, he had fought several duels, one of which killed his fellow dueler and left a bullet in Jackson's body until the day he died. And in 1824, Jackson, just 2 years into his Senate term, throws his hat into the rink for the election of 1824. The election would see a 3-part race between John Quincy Adams, or a 4-part race, between John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, who I haven't pictured here because he's not important. Sorry, William Crawford and all his descendants, and Andrew Jackson. It was a brutal political race, especially between Adams and Jackson, who very quickly become the favorites of the race. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, and he had an estimable political career by that point. He'd been a diplomat and an ambassador for the United States. He'd been a senator for the United States, and he was James Monroe's Secretary of State. Jackson was a war hero and was 2 years into his Senate career of the United States. Henry Clay was a long-serving member of the House, part of the War Hawk generation, along with John C. Calhoun. And the race went like this. Jackson won the highest number of electoral votes, but not a majority. And so no candidate won a majority in the Electoral College. And so in that case, under the rules of the Constitution, the election goes to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay finished last. He was obviously out of the race. And so Clay withdrew his name from competition. He left the race, and this allowed him to go back into the House, where he could help figure out who would win the election. And in 1824, the House declared John Quincy Adams the winner of the election of 1824. So John Quincy Adams is elected as president, chosen by the House of Representatives after the disputed election. When John Quincy Adams assembled his cabinet, he named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. This infuriated Andrew Jackson and Jackson's supporters, who called it the quote-unquote corrupt bargain. And indeed, it may have been. We don't have a smoking gun, but most historians believe that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay worked out a deal where Clay would engineer that John Quincy Adams would become president, and in return, he would name Henry Clay as Secretary of State. This election resulted in the formation of new political parties. The political party landscape realigned. And John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay helped engineer the creation of the successors of the Federalist Party. This party became known as the Whigs, and they inherited many of the Federalist ideas for politics. They included the belief in a strong central government like the Federalist. They wanted money for internal improvements for roads and canals and sort of internal improvements for commerce. And they were supporters of high tariffs to artificially increase the price of foreign manufactured goods to encourage Americans to consume domestic manufactured goods. The Jeffersonian Republican Party eventually morphed into the Democratic Party, created by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren in the 1820s after the election of 1824. And they were the inheritors of the Jeffersonian Republican political ideology, including commitment to small, limited government, They were a party mostly supported by farmers and immigrants, and they were believers in a low tariff. They wanted low tariffs because they wanted to encourage trade with Europe. It was the United Kingdom, for instance, which consumed most of the raw American cotton. And if most of your base is farmers, you don't want a poor trading relationship with Britain because they're consuming most of your cotton and most of your farm products. And so John Quincy Adams becomes President of the United States. Only the second non-Virginian to occupy the White House. Again, Quincy Adams had a long, distinguished career, being a diplomat, an ambassador, a senator, a secretary of state. He was the equivalent of Hillary Clinton of his time, for numerous reasons. He was easily one of the most qualified candidates ever, and he was widely viewed as corrupt after the 1824 quote-unquote corrupt bargain. He's also, the comparison to Hillary Clinton holds true also because he's not a terribly charismatic figure. He's a nationalist. He had cast a vote in favor of the Embargo Act for the national good over sectional interest. He was from New England, and this vote ruined his House political career. He was forced to resign his seat after he cast a vote in favor of the Embargo Act. And he was an ardent expansionist. He wanted the United States to expand, much like Jackson did. And he wanted to promote industry, agriculture, commerce, manufacturing. He was a believer in creating a national university, a naval academy, and he ardently believed that the United States would one day become the strongest power in the Western Hemisphere and maybe the world. Of course, we live in a time where the U.S. is one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Indeed, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. But in the 1820s, this is a ridiculous notion. The U.S. is a fledgling country. It's nowhere approaching any measure of power in the Western Hemisphere or the world. And so it's sort of a ridiculous notion that he believes this, but he's an ardent nationalist and an ardent expansionist. Quincy Adams spends more on internal improvements than his 5 previous predecessors combined, promoting agriculture, commerce, manufacturing, and all of his ideals. He believed in a spirit of improvement, in the government being an active promoter of commerce and development. And in his State of the Union address in December of 1825, he set forth a comprehensive program for government action. He called for legislation promoting agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing, and the, quote, mechanical and elegant arts. His plans included government-financed improvements in transportation, scientific expeditions, and the establishment of a national astronomical observatory. And Adams astonished many listeners with his bold statement, "Liberty is power." The United States, he argued, the freest nation on earth, would one day also become the mightiest. Here's a selection of his speech. Quote, "The spirit of improvement is abroad upon the earth. It stimulates the hearts and sharpens the faculties, not of our fellow citizens alone, but of the nations of Europe and of their rulers. While dwelling with pleasing satisfaction upon the superior excellence of our political institutions, let us not be unmindful that liberty is power, that the nation blessed with the largest portion of liberty must in proportion to its numbers be the most powerful nation upon earth, and that the tenure of power by man is, in the moral purposes of his Creator, upon condition that it shall be exercised to ends of beneficence, to improve the condition of himself and his fellow men, while foreign nations less blessed with that freedom, which is power, than ourselves, are advancing with gigantic strides in the career of public improvement. Were we to slumber in indolence or fold up our arms and proclaim to the world that we are palsied by the will of our constituents, would it not be to cast away the bounties of Providence and doom ourselves to perpetual inferiority? End quote. This is a new vision for the role of government as a facilitator of commerce and agriculture and expansion. Most Americans at the time didn't believe this. They believed that the government should serve to balance the budget for national security, and that really was it. This is a bold new vision, and indeed, it's one that's going to become prescient. It's going to actually become reality. In the 20th century, the United States government does become a bold promoter of industry and commerce and helps improve national industry, but also, is involved with the lives of everyday people, for better or worse. There we are, the end of our short exploration of the era of good feelings. I hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we will see you all soon.